And of note, you can pretty much tell that for the island line, compared to the island line, the Eastern Harbor Crossing, having only one station added, and actually hardly any, since that was just an infill station they've added. You can see that here in the beginning, it looks as if the biggest driver of costs is, in fact, the deep stations, as opposed to the tunneling. As if you compare that, a line that's mostly just bare tunnels is relatively inexpensive compared to those other three. And then the Chongwon extension of note, that one, of course, was built far shallower using a cut and cover technique, as opposed to the deep mining technique used on the idle line. So there you can see the cost premium of building deeper quite evident. And now we'll just go with an overview of the modified initial system. So that's just a map of those three lines as we had. And here's a good illustration of one of the station complexes. This one specifically is Wan Chai, which is close to the central business district. And right here, as you can see, that it illustrates pretty clearly the deep bore tunneling arrangement, and then also some of the ground geology as well on that end. So again, if you were deep digging in the granite, you could have self-supporting tunnels, but with decomposed granite, you're going to have to line them, otherwise they'd cave in. So in case, for those of you looking for other cities to compare, that would be some benchmark in terms of the geology is concerned. So now let's head into some of the more recent projects. Again, this is just a selection of projects that are fairly representative of how costs have evolved from the 1990s onwards. So the initial one we focus on here is the airport railway. That specifically is the point where, based on the mass transit railways annual reports, we're able to identify the costs actually starting to escalate at that point. As you can see, most of this line is either elevated or on the surface, yet at the same time, you're still seeing that it's coming at a pretty substantial cost that's getting close to where the cost of the shallow tunnel projects were coming in the previous decades. And then the other ones, of course, so we've got the Kwanton extension, so the Quarry Bay, that was just a pure relief line that was constructed. It had no new stations. It was just connecting some existing stations to the east of the central business district. And that is also quite evident. Compare that with the Eastern Harbor Crossing done 1 decade before, and you'll also notice a pretty significant cost explosion that, if for those of you paying attention, is not actually too far off from recent projects in New York if you just count the bare tunnels without the stations. And then the Chongwon Ode extension as well, again, that one mostly again all underground, and then you could see that by through deep bore stations, that the stations also adding a premium to that. So that would be, if you were to, since the Quantum extension and Chongwon extension, they're more or less done the same time frame. There you can actually see how much would deduce how much is it cost to add a deep station in a deep tunnel line right there. And lastly, the one I included here is just the Disneyland Resort line. It's both quarter inch tunnel, but the rest is on surface. And then you can see that even for a single track line, it's still coming in at in present day US dollars, at a triple figure million sum, low triple figure million sum there. So pretty much what I can deduce is sometime around the 1990s, early 2000s is when the costs came from some average, somewhat above average to well above average, if you were to take global benchmarking. And that's just a summary of the airport line right there. And this is actually a compelling case, subcase for further investigation because of matters of scope creep. But even though most of the lines on the surface, what's still unclear here that merits further investigation is what would be a cost premium if you did not have to fill in the land earlier, since much of the airport line was actually, in fact, built on fill in the north of just from the airport to the port district, most of the land was reclaimed. So did that confer a cost premium to any surface line or not? And you can see that it's under government public works, all that reclamation, though it's still interesting to figure out whether if that land were not reclaimed, if it were pre-existing land, would it have cost any less that had there been any other treatments necessary in order to build even a surface line on reclaimed land, for example. And this is one of the project's really explode section of the Admiralty station that was shown a bit earlier. Again, this also shows some of the newer extensions. And this points to a plausible explanation of why costs have gone even higher in recent years. And the numbers will be published through the Transit Cost Project later. It's still being updated. And you can see here with the newest line, South Island Line, which was opened not much more than half a decade ago. For that one, you can see it's even deeper than the 35-meter depth of the island line. So right here, just judging by it's roughly at least 50 meters deep. So roughly as deep as, in this case, the S-Bahn tunnel of the München underground. So they're building a new relief line in through the city center of München. 10 kilometers costing slightly under $500 million US of equivalent. So right there you can see, and this is another example of a relatively higher cost locality. So about a little under $500 million per kilometer. And even there, it's still worth diving into what explains some of the additional cost premium in Hong Kong. So if it's $500 million, and even in a place where it's easier to tunnel, as in you, for example, the Kwantung line, for instance, that the Tsun Kwan O extension, for example, that cost $750 million per kilometer. What's explaining that cost premium despite potentially easier tunneling conditions? And one thing to note, and many of you may have some questions about this, is the rail plus property model. And it's pretty well established by now that the Hong Kong approach is to cover the capital expense of expansion through property development. Not all of it, only part of it, because the entire operations are actually profitable if you take it on a fare box recovery basis, unlike what many in the Anglosphere have erroneously believed in the past. That said, there are certain issues with this in case of especially the problem around cost control, that some within Hong Kong have argued that thanks to rail plus property model, is it driving costs even higher because the incentive is that if costs are already high, then the incentive, of course, is to maximize charges for land sales. So is that actually exacerbating affordability in Hong Kong? And also, of course, that said, it does alleviate the problem with other people's money, in the sense of, to build a project, you'd actually have to evaluate how much own fiscal capacity you have, though that itself, as we see here, is far from sufficient from being able to contain costs. All it does is you can easily get away with own source revenue as long as you have an abundant amount of own source revenue because of very elevated price of land in Hong Kong. Of course, part of that is by geology, though a lot of it is, of course, art by artificial constraint, because about a third of the islands of the city's revenue comes from land sales. The incentive, of course, is to minimize how much land is available for development to push up land prices. And then here are just some items for future investigation. So again, in addition to rail plus property, we went over some scoping concerns, like potential overbuilding of stations, if you paid attention to the graphics, large mezzanines and such, and even some matters that tie more into politics, as in, were there circumstances around the handover to mainland China, to the PRC in 97, that was there additional political interference from that point on? And that was at the same time when there was an effort, and a rather successful one actually, unlike many others, to issue a public stock offering of the MTR in around 2000. And did that also have any effect on project planning, any effect on state capacity or not? So that is a pretty good wrap up, pointing to areas of further inquiry. So let's move on to questions now. It's going to be cut short a bit thanks to tech problems earlier, but hopefully get some in 5 minutes. So feel free to unmute yourself.